10% happier, how I tamed the voice in my head, reduced stress without losing my edge, and found self-help that actually works. A true story by Dan Harris. Picture this, you're live on national television. 5 million people have their eyes glued to you. You're sitting under the blazing lights of one of the most iconic news sets in the world, Good Morning America. Your favorite tie is perfectly knotted, your hair looks camera-ready, and from the outside, you're the absolute picture of confidence. This is the moment you've spent your entire career climbing toward. And then, without warning, it hits. A wave of primal, raw terror crashes through your brain. Paralyzing panic crawls up through your shoulders, floods over your head, and washes down your face. Your heart starts hammering like it's trying to escape your chest. Your mouth turns to sandpaper. The entire universe feels like it's caving in on you, and suddenly, you can't catch your breath. The teleprompter in front of you becomes a meaningless blur, but you know you've still got 4 more stories to deliver. It feels like an eternity, and there's absolutely nowhere to hide. This isn't some anxiety-fueled nightmare. This actually happened to ABC News anchor Dan Harris, right in the middle of a live broadcast in 2004. That spectacular on-air meltdown wasn't just a random case of stage fright. It was the complete collapse of a life built on something very specific and very familiar, the relentless, chattering, and often cruel voice that lives inside his head. It's a voice I'm betting you know intimately. It's that inner narrator that wakes up with you every morning, heckles you throughout the day, and keeps you tossing and turning at night, replaying every embarrassing moment and catastrophizing about tomorrow. Dan Harris had a perfectly blunt name for this voice. He called it an asshole. His journey to tame that voice is one of the most brutally honest, unexpectedly hilarious, and genuinely useful stories you'll ever hear. It's a journey that dragged him from war zones in the Middle East to the bizarre circus of self-help gurus, from sitting at the feet of the Dalai Lama to enduring a 10-day silent retreat that nearly shattered him. Today we're going to walk that path right alongside him. And here's my promise. By the time we're done, you'll understand the secret to taming that relentless voice in your own head. Not by wrestling it into submission, but by simply getting smarter than it. You'll discover a practical, no-nonsense approach to dialing down your stress and cranking up your happiness, not by some impossible 100%, but by a simple, achievable, and genuinely life-changing 10%. Dan Harris's story really kicks off with a deceptively simple motto, a piece of inherited wisdom from his father, a brilliant but perpetually anxious doctor. The motto went like this: "The price of security is insecurity." Let that marinate for a second. To be successful, to be safe, to achieve anything worthwhile, you had to be constantly on guard, perpetually worried, always scanning the horizon for the next disaster. For Dan, this wasn't just fatherly advice floating around in the background. It became his entire operating system. He described himself as a quote, frequent mental inventory taker, always poking at his bruises to see if they still hurt. And honestly, for a long time, it worked like a charm. This constant, low-grade hum of anxiety became his rocket fuel. Fresh out of college, he dove headfirst into television news, starting at a tiny station in Maine for a whopping $5.50 an hour. But the guy was driven. He loved the craft, the adrenaline rush of chasing down stories, and, let's be real, the deeply satisfying ego boost of being recognized on the street. That drive, that nagging insecurity, launched him up the ladder at lightning speed, from rural Maine to Boston, and then, at just 28 years old, to the ultimate prize, ABC News in New York. He'd made it to the big leagues, but the voice in his head, it only cranked up the volume. Now he was swimming with the real sharks. The news division was a cutthroat battlefield, and prowling at the top of the food chain was the legendary anchor Peter Jennings. Jennings was Dan's idol, smooth, commanding, practically the voice of authority itself. He was also his mentor and, at times, his torturer. Working for Jennings was like voluntarily sticking your head in a lion's mouth. Exhilarating, sure, but definitely not what you'd call safe. Jennings had a volcanic temper and seemed to genuinely enjoy humiliating his young correspondents in front of everyone. Dan lived in a perpetual state of red alert, trapped in an endless mental loop. How many stories have I gotten on air this week? What does Peter think of me right this second? The insecurity that had once been his engine was now threatening to burn the whole thing down. And then September 11th, 2001 happened. That day changed absolutely everything. For Dan, it ignited a new, far more dangerous kind of ambition. Covering the aftermath from the smoking ruins of Ground Zero, he knew that the fluffy, feel-good stories he'd been doing at the end of the broadcast weren't going to cut it anymore. He wanted to be at the white-hot center of the biggest story of his lifetime. A few weeks later, the foreign desk called with those magic words, "We need you to go to Pakistan." A pint of pure dopamine flooded his brain. This was the beginning of what he'd later call his addiction to journalistic heroin, that pure, sick rush of being somewhere you absolutely should not be, not only surviving it, but getting on television doing it. He spent the next 3 years bouncing back and forth between New York and war zones in Afghanistan, Iraq, Israel, and Gaza. He was floating on an endless wave of adrenaline, completely addicted to airtime, and totally blind to the psychological carnage piling up behind him. He witnessed things no human being should ever have to see. A neat row of dismembered legs revealed when someone lifted a blood-soaked bedsheet after a suicide bombing. A father's anguished wailing as he spotted his son's body being tossed unceremoniously into a mass grave. But at the time, he felt nothing. Or rather, he convinced himself he felt nothing. He told himself this emotional detachment was just part of the job, like a surgeon staying cool and collected during a complicated operation. When people back home asked if the experience had changed him, his automatic answer was always no. He wasn't traumatized. He loved being a war correspondent. He loved the bodyguards, the armored vehicles, the illicit, energizing thrill of being in a place where all the normal rules had been completely tossed out the window. But the war eventually came to an end for him, at least temporarily. In 2003, after a grueling 5-month tour in Iraq, he came home to a depressingly empty apartment and a personal life that had completely evaporated. And that's when his body started sending him an overdue bill for all the horror he'd witnessed. He developed this mysterious, flu-like illness that dragged on for months. He felt tired and achy all the time. He got tested for everything from exotic tropical diseases to HIV, but every single test came back negative. Finally, he broke down and saw a psychiatrist, who took about 5 minutes to deliver a diagnosis: depression. The doctor explained that when you're emotionally cut off, those buried feelings often start showing up in your body instead. He had 2 theories. Either the horror Dan had witnessed was simply too overwhelming for his conscious mind to process, or he was subconsciously pining for the adrenaline rush of the war zone. He was basically going through withdrawal from journalistic heroin. Unfortunately, Dan had already started self-medicating. One night, a colleague casually offered him cocaine, and on a total whim, he said yes. He was 32 years old. The drug hit him like a triumphant symphony of euphoric energy. After dragging himself through months of feeling utterly depleted, he suddenly felt better than normal. He felt restored. He soon discovered ecstasy, which wrapped his entire torso in what felt like warm, heated cotton balls and made everything, even just talking to people, feel absolutely blissful. But here's the thing about messing with your brain chemistry: there's no free lunch. The come-downs were absolutely brutal, leaving him feeling like a hollowed-out shell of a human being. But the pull of the drugs was incredibly powerful. He knew he was taking a massive professional gamble. If anyone found out, he'd be instantly fired. Yet he carried on anyway, his common sense completely hijacked by the pleasure centers of his brain. He was basically sleepwalking through a cascade of spectacularly stupid behavior. Which brings us right back to that moment. June 7, 2004, sitting on the set of Good Morning America. As he sat there, completely live on air, that lightning bolt of terror wasn't just ordinary stage fright. It was his body's final, desperate alarm bell, screaming for attention. The psychiatrist he saw afterward, Dr. Brotman, connected the dots immediately. Frequent cocaine use jacks up the levels of adrenaline flooding through your brain, dramatically increasing your odds of having a panic attack. What Dan experienced was an overwhelming surge of that ancient fight-or-flight response. Except in this surreal case, he was somehow both the charging saber-toothed tiger and the terrified caveman desperately trying to escape it. The doctor's prescription was refreshingly simple: stop doing drugs immediately. Faced with the very real possibility of his career imploding in spectacular fashion, Dan agreed without hesitation. He quit cold turkey. But that was only the very beginning. The sheer enormity of his mindlessness started sinking in like a stone. He realized he needed to make some much deeper changes. His search for answers began, oddly enough, with an assignment Peter Jennings had handed him years earlier, one he'd actively tried to weasel out of: covering religion. As a thoroughly committed agnostic, Dan thought organized religion was complete nonsense, and that anyone who truly believed, whether in Jesus or jihad, must be missing a few brain cells. His coverage was, at first, like watching a tourist gawking at animals in an open-air zoo, deliberately focusing on the absolute strangest fare he could dig up. But then he met someone who completely shifted his perspective: Pastor Ted Haggard, the charismatic head of a massive evangelical megachurch in Colorado Springs. Ted was relentlessly upbeat, with this almost Clinton-esque ability to make you feel like you were the single most important person in the entire world. Dan went in fully expecting to meet a walking caricature, but what he found instead was a sharp, surprisingly candid guy who didn't try to convert him and wasn't the least bit defensive about his faith. Talking to Ted, Dan had this uncomfortable realization about how thoughtlessly judgmental he'd been about religious people. It hit him square in the face that he'd blindly swallowed every stereotype whole. Ted became Dan's inside source on the entire world of evangelicalism, his first call for honest, off-the-record answers. And then one morning the bombshell dropped. Ted Haggard, a married father of 5 and one of the most influential evangelical leaders in America, had been accused by a male escort of paying for sex and crystal meth. The story was completely true. Ted's carefully constructed life imploded in the most spectacular, tabloid-ready fashion imaginable. For Dan, it was obviously a huge professional story, but it also felt deeply personal. Months later, he conducted the first major network interview with the disgraced pastor. What struck him most powerfully wasn't the breathtaking hypocrisy or the elaborate deception. It was that in Ted's absolute darkest moments, when he was seriously contemplating suicide, his faith remained his primary source of comfort. It gave him this sense that his catastrophic troubles somehow had a larger purpose. And Dan, who had just barely crawled through his own self-inflicted crisis, found himself genuinely envious. For the first time in his life, he saw real value in having a perspective that reached beyond the mundane grind of daily life. As he put it perfectly, if you're never looking up, you're always just looking around. He wasn't about to start believing in God anytime soon, but something important had shifted. He was finally ready for something more. And that something more arrived wrapped in the most deeply weird and confusing package imaginable. A producer on his team, a woman named Felicia, suggested he read a book by this self-help guru named Eckhart Tolle. The book, A New Earth, had an embarrassingly cheesy cover and bore the stamp of Oprah's book club. At first, Dan thought it was pure, irredeemable nonsense. A relentless fire hose of incomprehensible jargon like conditioned mind structures and the one indwelling consciousness. He found himself rolling his eyes so hard they hurt, mentally cursing Felicia for inflicting this torture upon him. But then, like stumbling into a clearing in a dense forest, something clicked. Tolle began unfolding this genuinely fascinating idea, one that made Dan feel like the author had somehow spent an enormous amount of time living inside his own skull. Our entire lives, Tolle argued, are completely governed by a voice in our heads. This voice is just this ceaseless, never-ending stream of thinking, and most of it is negative, endlessly repetitive, and obsessively self-referential. It's totally fixated on the past and the future, completely at the expense of the present moment, which is literally all we ever actually have. This voice, Tolle called the ego. And crucially, it wasn't just about being an arrogant jerk, it was our very fundamental sense of I, our inner narrator running commentary on everything. Dan suddenly recognized this voice as the root source of absolutely all his troubles. It was the voice that casually suggested, "Hey, you should do cocaine." It was the voice that was never, ever satisfied, that constantly compared him to everyone around him, that practically thrived on unnecessary drama. As he lay in bed late that night, it was the very first time he truly realized that the voice in his head, this running commentary that had completely dominated his entire life since he could first remember, was without question an asshole. He was absolutely hooked. But just as he was concluding that Tolle was some kind of enlightened sage holding the master key to all his problems, Tolle started saying some genuinely ridiculous things. He claimed that living fully in the present moment somehow slows down the aging process and makes the actual molecular structure of your body less dense. He'd toggle seamlessly between profound insights and complete pseudoscientific nonsense, between incisive wisdom and total insanity. Dan honestly couldn't figure out if the man was a misunderstood genius or a well-spoken lunatic. Even worse, Tolle offered this brilliant diagnosis of the human condition but basically zero practical action plan for how to actually combat the ego. His advice essentially boiled down to just be aware of the voice. For Dan, that was like calmly telling someone whose hair is actively on fire to simply be aware of the flames. He didn't need awareness, he needed a fire extinguisher. His search continued. He met Deepak Chopra, quite possibly the most famous guru on the entire planet. Chopra, with his signature rhinestone glasses and obvious love of the spotlight, also claimed to be permanently living in the present, existing in a state of quote, effortless spontaneity. But Dan watched him frantically pounding away at his BlackBerry while walking down the street, and arguing with genuine zeal during a televised debate. The guy seemed like a walking contradiction. With Tolle, Dan believed he was completely sincere, but couldn't tell if he was actually sane. With Deepak, he believed he was probably sane, but couldn't tell if he was being sincere. He even took a deep dive into the cultural phenomenon of The Secret, that wildly popular philosophy promising you could manifest anything you wanted. Perfect health, enormous wealth, true love, simply by thinking about it really hard. He found it to be a world of genuinely dangerous stupidity, a philosophy that ultimately ended up blaming victims for their own terrible misfortunes. He was at his absolute wit's end, still completely intrigued by the diagnosis of the chattering ego, but utterly lost on how to actually treat it. And then his wife, Bianca, came swooping in to the rescue. She vaguely remembered reading some books years earlier by a psychiatrist and practicing Buddhist named Dr. Mark Epstein. She handed them over to Dan. That night, as he cracked open the first one and started reading, it was like that first electric evening with Tolle, only without any of the embarrassment or eye-rolling. It became blazingly, crystal clear. The absolute best parts of Eckhart Tolle's entire body of work were basically just unattributed Buddhism. 2,500 years before Tolle started cashing those fat royalty checks, it was the Buddha who first came up with that brilliant diagnosis of exactly how the human mind actually works. The insatiable wanting, the complete inability to stay present, the repetitive mental loops. It was all right there, but refreshingly without the pseudoscience and the grandiose language. The Buddhists even had their own perfect name for the constant churning of the ego. They called it the monkey mind. Dan absolutely dove in, devouring everything he could get his hands on. He learned that the Buddha's central thesis was that in a world where literally everything is constantly changing, a concept they call impermanence, we suffer because we desperately cling to things that simply won't last. We get emotionally attached to people, possessions, our career success, all of which will ultimately evaporate like morning fog. The actual route to happiness, the Buddha argued, wasn't to deny this uncomfortable truth, but to achieve a deep, visceral, bone-level understanding of it. It was about genuinely embracing what he called the wisdom of insecurity. That phrase hit Dan like a lightning bolt straight to the brain. It was the absolutely perfect rejoinder to his father's old price of security motto. If there's genuinely no such thing as real security, then why on earth bother with all the exhausting insecurity? Buddhism had the diagnosis nailed down cold, and unlike all those slippery self-help gurus, it actually had a real prescription, an actual, practical program, a radical kind of internal jujitsu move, specifically designed to peacefully disarm the asshole living rent-free in your head. The problem was, Dan found the prescription absolutely repellent. The only real way to tame the monkey mind, the Buddhists insisted, was to meditate. And for Dan, meditation was basically the distilled essence of everything that sucked about the whole granola-crunching lifestyle. He pictured himself trapped in some room that smelled like feet, surrounded by unbearably smug practitioners ringing little bells and intoning Om in perfect unison. Plus, he had roughly the attention span of an overexcited yellow lab. He just assumed clearing his mind was flat out impossible for someone like him. His resistance might have lasted forever, but then two things happened in quick succession. First, his own psychiatrist, Dr. Brotman, casually mentioned that a former Harvard colleague had written this best-selling book about the genuine health benefits of meditation, like significantly lowering blood pressure. The perpetual hypochondriac in Dan was immediately intrigued. Second, he actually read a few books explaining what Buddhist meditation genuinely involved, and learned you absolutely didn't have to wear flowing robes or chant in Sanskrit. And most crucially, he discovered that the goal isn't actually to clear your mind completely. That's literally impossible for human beings. The entire game is simply to notice the exact moment when your mind has inevitably wandered off, and then gently, without any self-judgment, bring it back. Over and over and over again. So one lazy afternoon, while on vacation with friends, he quietly sneaked off to a bedroom to give it an honest try. He sat down on the floor, set his phone's alarm for just 5 minutes, and began. His mind was an absolute 3-ring circus. In, out, in, shrubbery. I really like that word. Come on, dude, get in the game. In, out. Man, my butt really hurts. Oh, idea for an old-school hip-hop show. Rap Van Winkle. Now I've got an itch. What was even the best thing before sliced bread existed? When the alarm finally went off, it genuinely felt like an eternity had crawled by. He didn't exactly like it, but he had to respect it. This wasn't some fluffy, feel-good hippie technique for finding your inner child. This was genuinely rigorous brain exercise. Rep after mental representative of trying to tame the runaway freight train of the mind. It was actually kind of a badass endeavor. He made a firm resolution to do it every single day. The daily practice was pretty miserable at first. He was constantly beset by random itches, crushing fatigue, and an absolute fire hose of intrusive thoughts. But it did offer something genuinely huge, an actual, concrete method for shutting down the monkey mind, if only for a fleeting moment. It was the only real solution he'd managed to find yet, and pretty soon, he started noticing the benefits showing up off the cushion. He began using his breath as a tool to jolt himself back into the present moment, while stuck in endless airport security lines, or impatiently waiting for an elevator. But the real secret sauce of Buddhism went by a hopelessly boring, almost clinical name: mindfulness. In a nutshell, mindfulness is simply the ability to recognize exactly what's happening in your mind right now: anger, jealousy, crushing sadness, without getting completely carried away by it. It's basically a fourth option, beyond our 3 totally habitual responses to absolutely everything: wanting it desperately, rejecting it completely, or just zoning out entirely. It's about viewing the swirling contents of your mind with a calm, non-judgmental distance. Dan knew he desperately, urgently needed this skill. He could clearly see how it could short-circuit his habitual, totally mindless chain reactions. Like getting unreasonably snippy with Bianca just because he was still mentally stewing about something annoying from the office hours earlier. This was the actual key to genuinely responding to life with intention, rather than just blindly reacting to it on autopilot. He knew he needed to go significantly deeper, so he took the full plunge. He signed up for a 10-day silent meditation retreat. No talking whatsoever. No TV, no phone, no sex. Just meditation, literally all day, every single day. He privately called it the Zen Death March. The first few days were, in his perfectly chosen words, straight torture, son. He was relentlessly assaulted by excruciating back pain, this uncontrollable compulsive urge to keep swallowing saliva, and just this overwhelming tidal wave of crushing boredom and corrosive self-doubt. On day 4, which happened to be his 39th birthday, he was absolutely convinced it was hands down the worst birthday of his entire life. He was actively drowning in misery, genuinely, seriously, considering just quitting and going home. In absolute desperation, he went to see one of the apprentice teachers, a woman named Spring, whom he had instantly, viscerally disliked for her annoyingly soft, cloying speaking style. But when he finally confessed his struggle, she completely dropped the funny voice and spoke to him like an actual normal person. "You're trying way too hard," she said simply. "It's the total opposite of regular daily life, where we do something and naturally expect a specific result. Here, it's literally just about sitting with whatever happens to be there." That one simple piece of advice changed absolutely everything. He walked back to his room, sat down on his cushion, and just decided to lower the volume, to genuinely stop straining so hard against reality. And then, just a few minutes in, something fundamentally clicked into place. He fell into this state the Buddhists have a specific term for: choiceless awareness. It was like, after literally days of desperately trying to tune in a fuzzy radio station, he finally stumbled onto exactly the right frequency. His mind just naturally started letting its focus gently fall on whatever was most prominent in that exact moment. Neck pain, knee pain, airplane passing overhead, birdsong in the distance, breeze brushing across my forearm. He wasn't trying anymore. It was just effortlessly happening. It was like he suddenly had a front row seat to watch the intricate machinery of consciousness itself, all these mental objects arising and passing away with incredible speed. And the simple act of being genuinely present in this way produced this absolutely gigantic blast of pure serotonin flooding his system. He felt like he'd spent 5 full days being painfully dragged behind a speeding motorboat, and had suddenly, miraculously popped up on water skis. The natural high only got more exquisite from there. During a loving-kindness compassion meditation, where he was gently instructed to picture his loved ones and mentally send them heartfelt well wishes, he was completely overcome by silent, heaving sobs. Tears streamed steadily down his face, pooling up behind his ears. When he finally walked out of the meditation hall afterward, he was riding these crashing waves of pure bliss. Everything around him looked impossibly bright, impossibly crisp. It was, he said without exaggeration, the absolute best high of his entire life. Easily 1,000 times better than any drug he'd ever touched. The retreat taught him the single most valuable lesson of all. It came during a question-and-answer session when he directly challenged the teacher, Joseph Goldstein, about the very real need to worry about actual problems in the real world. Goldstein's answer was disarmingly simple. He said it's completely fine to worry, to carefully plan, to think intelligently about the future. But when you catch yourself running through the exact same worry loop for the 17th time that day, you should pause and ask yourself one beautifully simple question. Is this useful? Is this useful? It was the perfect, elegant corrective to his father's deeply ingrained old motto. It was the exact tool he needed to intelligently tame his compulsive impulse to overthink everything without stupidly throwing the baby out with the bathwater. When Dan finally returned to the real world, he discovered a clever way to talk about his new practice, without sounding like he'd joined some weird cult. When curious friends asked him about the whole meditation thing, he'd just casually say, "It makes me 10% happier." It was the absolutely perfect slogan. Catchy, demonstrably true, and it brilliantly counter-programmed against all the ridiculous overpromising of the entire self-help industry. But actually integrating this new perspective with his deeply ambitious career wasn't remotely easy. His newfound sense of inner calmness started looking disturbingly like passivity to others. he just stopped aggressively fighting for the big, prestigious assignments. His wife Bianca started thinking he was being kind of a wuss about his career. The final wake-up call came directly from his new boss, Ben Sherwood, who looked him dead straight in the eye during a tense meeting and said bluntly, "Stop being so zen." Dan had this sudden, uncomfortable realization that he'd completely confused letting go with just going soft. That very night, he met up with his friend, Dr. Mark Epstein, who gave him another absolutely crucial piece of advice: hide the zen. He patiently explained that it was entirely possible to compete aggressively in your career, to be someone your rivals genuinely had to contend with, while deep inside, remaining fundamentally calm and centered. The final missing piece of the puzzle was this powerful concept of non-attachment to results. Striving is perfectly fine, Mark carefully explained, as long as it's intelligently tempered by the clear realization that the final outcome is ultimately out of your direct control. Do absolutely everything you possibly can to succeed, but don't get emotionally attached to the specific outcome. That way, if you do fail, you'll be maximally resilient, totally able to dust yourself off and jump right back into the fray. This was it, the actual holy grail he'd been searching for. The perfect marriage of the price of security and the wisdom of insecurity. Dan Harris had finally discovered his complete framework, a genuinely holistic answer for how to be a happier, better version of himself without becoming professionally ineffective. He carefully codified it all in a list he appropriately called The Way of the Warrior, a set of 10 core precepts for the modern corporate samurai. It included principles like don't be a jerk, when necessary, hide the zen, the price of security is insecurity until it's not useful, and of course, simply meditate. In the end, he realized the voice in his head is still, in many fundamental ways, kind of an asshole. The crucial difference is that mindfulness now does a pretty damn good job of metaphorically tying that voice up and slapping duct tape over its mouth. He's still absolutely a hard worker, still genuinely believes in maintaining a healthy amount of productive neuroticism. But he now knows, with absolute certainty, that widening his circle of concern beyond his own petty crap is what truly makes him happy. Dan Harris's entire journey is so genuinely powerful because it's so deeply universally relatable. Most of us will thankfully never have a full-blown panic attack on live national television, but we all intimately know that uncomfortable feeling of being completely hijacked by our own minds. We all have that persistent inner critic, that relentless worrier, that chaotic monkey mind that swings wildly from branch to branch, never actually settling down anywhere. What this book teaches us, with such refreshing honesty and self-deprecating humor, is that you absolutely don't have to remain a prisoner of that voice forever. You can, in fact, learn to relate to it in a completely different way. And the way you actually do that isn't through some mystical, magical overnight transformation, but through a deceptively simple, eminently practical, and yes, sometimes very difficult exercise. The most profound lesson here is that happiness genuinely isn't something that just randomly happens to you like winning the lottery. It's not purely a matter of dumb luck, or finally getting that big promotion, or finding the perfect romantic relationship. As the rapidly growing science is now clearly showing, happiness is actually a trainable skill. It's a skill you can deliberately cultivate and strengthen, exactly like you methodically train your body at the gym. Your brain isn't some fixed, unchangeable thing. It's constantly changing and rewiring itself in direct response to your experiences, a fascinating concept called neuroplasticity. And meditation is quite simply the most direct, effective way to consciously take the reins and actively sculpt your brain for the better. But perhaps the most genuinely liberating idea in 10% Happier is the one sitting right there in the refreshingly modest title. It's the revolutionary idea that you absolutely don't need to aim for some impossible state of perpetual, unending bliss. You don't need to somehow transform into a blissed-out zombie, as Harris genuinely feared he might. You can absolutely keep your ambition intact, keep your competitive edge sharp, keep your fundamental drive alive. The actual goal is simply to get just a little bit better, to suffer just a little bit less, to be just a little less of a jerk to yourself and the people around you. A 10% improvement might not sound particularly dramatic or impressive, but when you consistently apply it to your baseline level of well-being, day after day after day, it genuinely compounds into something truly life-changing. If you're even slightly curious about putting some of these ideas into actual practice, here are a few simple, concrete things you can try starting today. First, just try to actively notice the voice. For the rest of today, see if you can catch that inner narrator red-handed in the act. Notice when it's harshly judging, when it's pointlessly worrying, when it's endlessly complaining about nothing. You don't have to do anything dramatic about it. Just simply acknowledging that it's there, and crucially, that it isn't actually you, is a genuinely huge first step forward. Second, try meditating for literally just 5 minutes. That's all. Sit comfortably in a chair, keep your back reasonably straight, and for just 5 minutes, simply try to feel the physical sensation of your breath moving in and out. When your mind inevitably wanders off, and I absolutely promise you, it will wander constantly, the entire goal isn't to get frustrated with yourself. The whole practice is contained right there in that simple moment of realizing you're lost in thought, and then gently, without any harsh judgment, starting over again. And finally, the very next time you catch yourself stuck in an endless loop of unproductive worry, ask yourself that simple, brilliantly clarifying question, is this useful? You'll be genuinely surprised how often the honest answer is a resounding no, and how that simple recognition alone can break the spell completely. That was our look inside 10% Happier by Dan Harris. We've journeyed through the essential core of his story together today. But here's the honest truth. A summary can only show you the basic map. The real treasure, the genuine transformation, is found when you actually walk the path yourself. The real magic happens in those quiet, personal moments of reading, when a particular story, or even just a simple phrase, unexpectedly connects with something deep inside you in a way you didn't see coming. This summary is really your guide to help you decide if this book deserves your precious time and attention. If anything we've explored together today has sparked even a small light of recognition in you, I genuinely encourage you to grab yourself a copy. Reading it isn't just about passively learning some new interesting ideas. It's an actual experience that can genuinely change the fundamental way you relate to the voice in your head, and honestly, to your entire life. A direct link to the book is waiting for you in the description below. Also, if you found this summary genuinely valuable and want to keep exploring more life-changing books together with us, please show your support by hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. It really lets us know we're on the right track and makes sure you won't miss our next journey into another incredible book. Let's keep growing and learning together.